What if the worst moment of captivity wasn't punishment, hunger, or violence, but the moment the guards offered a choice and stepped back, leaving the prisoners to decide alone, knowing that whatever they chose would follow them forever, and that refusing to choose might be the most dangerous option of all? The day began without any visible difference. Yet everyone sensed that something invisible had shifted during the night, something subtle but heavy, like air before a storm that refuses to break, because the camp woke as it always did, with the same metallic sounds, the same routines drilled into muscle memory, the same slow movement of bodies conditioned to obey long before thought could intervene, and still, beneath that familiar surface, there was a tension that did not belong to hunger, exhaustion, or fear, but to something quieter and more disturbing. The prisoners lined up for roll call, as usual, boots aligned in the dirt, eyes forward, back straight. Not because anyone was watching closely, but because the habit of standing correctly had become a form of self-preservation, a way to disappear inside conformity. And yet, even as the numbers were counted and recounted with mechanical precision, it became clear that the guard were not behaving as they normally did, because they did not rush, they did not bark orders, and they did not correct posture or spacing, choosing instead to step back once the count was complete, creating an unfamiliar pocket of silence where instruction should have been. Minutes passed, then more minutes, long enough for discomfort to spread without a clear source, long enough for the prisoners to begin exchanging brief glances that carried more meaning than words ever could, because silence in a camp was never neutral, and the absence of direction felt heavier than any shouted command, as if something had been removed rather than imposed, leaving behind an uncertainty that pressed inward rather than outward. No one spoke at first, not because they were forbidden, but because no one knew whether speaking would be a mistake, and the yard itself seemed to hold its breath, the open sky offering no answers, the fences remaining unchanged yet suddenly more symbolic than physical, while the guard stood at a distance that felt deliberate, not inattentive, but intentional, as though observation had replaced control, and control had been handed over without explanation. The prisoners waited, expecting at any moment to be told where to go, what to do, how to proceed, because movement without instruction was unthinkable. And yet the instruction never came, allowing time itself to become the problem, stretching until the smallest sounds became unbearable, a cough, a shift of weight, the scrape of fabric, each one echoing too loudly into shared awareness that something was wrong, even if no one could articulate what that wrongness was. Some men began to feel the strain physically, shoulders tightening, jaws clenching, breaths becoming shallow as thoughts turned inward, because uncertainty demanded interpretation, and interpretation invited fear, and fear fed on imagination far more effectively than on reality, especially when reality refused to explain itself, leaving every possibility open and therefore dangerous. The guards remained still, not intervening, not correcting, not clarifying, their presence reduced to a distant constant rather than an active force. And that distance created a strange reversal, where authority no longer announced itself through action, but through restraint, through the decision to wait, to allow something else to unfold without guidance, as though the responsibility for the next moment no longer belonged to the camp, but to the men standing within it. No announcement followed, no whistle blew, no officer stepped forward, and gradually, the realization began to form, not as a clear thought, but as a pressure behind the eyes, that the absence of orders might itself be the point, that doing nothing could be as consequential as doing something, and that the familiar rules governing survival had quietly shifted without warning. The prisoners stood there, suspended between habit and instinct, between obedience and initiative, between waiting and acting, knowing only that whatever happened next would not be corrected, Not immediately, not visibly, and that the lack of response from the guards was not neglect, but observation, a silent watching that felt more invasive than surveillance ever had before. Time continued to move, indifferent to confusion, and with every passing second, the camp felt less like a place of enforced control and more like a space where responsibility had been returned without consent, where the weight of decision hovered just out of reach, undefined but unavoidable, waiting for someone or something to break the stillness and reveal what had already begun. And still no one moved. What unsettled the prisoners most was not the silence itself, but the way it began to reshape their awareness minute by minute. Because once the initial shock of waiting passed, a deeper unease took its place, an unease rooted in the realization that nothing was preventing them from acting except their own hesitation, and that this hesitation, once merely a survival reflex, had now become the central force holding the camp in suspension. The yard slowly transformed from a space of routine into a space of calculation, where every man stood not only in relation to the guards or the fences, but in relation to the others around him, aware that any movement would be noticed, not by authority alone, but by peers whose reactions could not be predicted, because shared uncertainty has a way of isolating people even when they stand shoulder to shoulder. Some began to shift their weight deliberately, testing the ground beneath their boots as if searching for permission in the texture of the dirt, while others fixed their gaze forward with renewed intensity, choosing stillness not out of obedience, but out of fear that the smallest deviation might carry consequences that could not be reversed, consequences that would arrive without warning or explanation, just as this silence had. The guards did not intervene, and their continued restraint altered the balance further, because authority that does not assert itself forces those beneath it to confront something far more uncomfortable than discipline: the responsibility of choice, and choice, when stripped of guidance, becomes a burden rather than a privilege, especially in a place where every previous decision had been dictated with absolute clarity. Time passed unevenly, stretching and compressing in ways that made it difficult to measure, as if the camp itself had slipped out of alignment with the rest of the world. And with each passing interval, the men became increasingly aware of their own bodies, the ache in their legs, the dryness in their mouths, the subtle tremor in their hands, physical reminders that waiting was not neutral, but active, demanding endurance without offering purpose. A few prisoners exchanged brief murmurs, not conversations, just fragments of sound that carried uncertainty rather than information, and even these small attempts at connection felt risky, because without clear boundaries, no one could be sure where the line between acceptable behavior and violation now lay, or whether such a line still existed at all. The absence of immediate punishment began to distort expectations, because restraint without consequence can feel more threatening than violence with rules. And as the guards continued to observe without reacting, the possibility emerged that this was not an oversight, not a delay, but an intentional condition, one designed to reveal something about the men themselves rather than to enforce something upon them. Some prisoners began to suspect that the moment of decision had already arrived, not announced, not highlighted, but quietly placed before them, waiting to be acknowledged, while others clung to the belief that instruction would eventually return, that order would reassert itself, restoring the familiar structure in which survival meant obedience rather than interpretation. The yard filled with an unspoken tension that grew heavier with each unanswered expectation, because waiting had ceased to be passive and had become a test of endurance, awareness, and restraint, one that offered no visible endpoint, only the growing certainty that whatever came next would be shaped not by commands, but by reactions. No one moved decisively, yet the stillness itself began to feel like a collective action, a shared decision to delay the unknown for as long as possible. Even as fatigue crept in and concentration wavered, because doing nothing, when nothing is demanded, requires more discipline than obedience ever had. The guards remained at their posts, distant but attentive, allowing the situation to deepen rather than resolve. And in that prolonged pause, the prisoners began to understand, without fully articulating it, that the camp had not become less controlled, but differently controlled, and that the absence of orders was not freedom, but the beginning of something far more complex. And still, the question remained unanswered, not spoken aloud, but present in every measured breath and restrained movement, whether waiting was still the safest option, or whether safety itself had quietly changed its meaning. As the hours stretched further, the certainty that had once governed life inside the camp began to erode in subtle but unmistakable ways, because the longer the silence endured, the more difficult it became to distinguish between restraint imposed from outside and restraint maintained from within, and this uncertainty crept into the minds of the prisoners with a persistence that no command had ever achieved. What unsettled them was not the possibility of punishment, but the absence of confirmation, the lack of any signal that might define the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Because without those boundaries, every thought carried weight, and every impulse required evaluation, not against a rulebook, but against an imagined outcome that could not be tested safely. Some men began to notice changes in the way others stood or breathed, small variations that would once have gone unnoticed, but now felt significant, as if the camp had become a place where observation itself was a form of participation, and where the act of watching one another slowly replaced the comfort once provided by routine. The guards continued their silence, and this consistency only intensified the tension, because it suggested intention rather than oversight, a deliberate withholding that forced the prisoners to confront the uncomfortable possibility that this situation was unfolding exactly as planned, even if its purpose remained unclear. Fatigue deepened, not just in the body, but in the mind, as the effort required to remain alert without instruction began to wear away concentration, making it harder to recall the simple logic that once governed daily life, and easier for doubt to settle in, reshaping familiar assumptions into fragile constructions that could no longer support certainty. Some prisoners found themselves replaying earlier moments from their captivity, searching for patterns or precedents that might explain the present. But these reflections offered no clarity because nothing in their experience had prepared them for a condition in which authority remained visible yet inactive, present yet unspoken, powerful yet deliberately restrained. The absence of movement began to feel increasingly deliberate, as if stillness itself had become a statement. And yet no one could say with confidence what that statement meant, or whether it was being interpreted correctly, because interpretation, once introduced, could not be undone. A few men shifted their stance more frequently now, not out of restlessness, but out of an unconscious attempt to reassert control over their own bodies, as if movement, however small, might anchor them to something tangible in a situation that had become abstract and unsettling. Time continued to distort, with moments stretching into long, indistinct intervals, making it difficult to determine how long they had already waited or how much longer they might be expected to endure, and this temporal uncertainty further weakened the sense of structure that once made the camp predictable, if not bearable. The realization slowly emerged that the greatest pressure was no longer external, but internal, because each man now carried his own expectations, fears, and calculations, all competing silently within him, shaping his perception of risk and restraint without the reassurance of confirmation from those in power. The yard remained unchanged, the fences unmoving, the guards stationary. Yet the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly, because what had begun as silence had evolved into something heavier, something that demanded interpretation rather than obedience, and endurance rather than compliance. By this point, the prisoners understood, without openly acknowledging it, that the situation was no longer defined by what might happen to them, but by what they might choose to do or choose not to do, and that this choice, however subtle, was already altering the nature of their captivity. And as the stillness persisted, one unsettling possibility began to take shape in the background of their thoughts, that the camp was no longer waiting for them to fail or resist, but simply waiting to see who would decide first. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, the men could no longer ignore the sensation that the silence surrounding them was not empty, but occupied, filled with a tension that could not be seen yet was constantly felt, as though the camp itself had become an observer rather than a place, watching without interruption or response. The guards had not changed position, nor had they spoken, and this unbroken stillness began to feel less like neutrality and more like measurement, because the longer it lasted, the clearer it became that every movement, every hesitation, and every subtle adjustment was being noted, not overtly, but with a patience that suggested intention. What unsettled the prisoners most was the realization that nothing they did seemed to trigger a reaction, because even actions that would once have drawn immediate correction now passed without acknowledgement, creating a vacuum where cause and effect no longer followed familiar patterns, leaving them unsure whether restraint was expected, rewarded, or simply irrelevant. Some men became acutely aware of their own posture, holding themselves unnaturally still for long stretches of time, as if immobility itself might communicate compliance, while others found it increasingly difficult to suppress small movements, not out of defiance, but from the growing strain of maintaining control in an environment that offered no feedback. The awareness of being watched without instruction created a quiet pressure that seeped into thought, making every decision feel heavier than before, because without explicit rules, each choice carried the risk of misinterpretation, and misinterpretation, in this context, felt more dangerous than disobedience ever had. Conversations did not begin, not because they were forbidden, but because no one could be certain whether speaking would break an unspoken expectation, and this uncertainty transformed silence into a shared burden, one that isolated each man within his own calculations even as they stood together. The yard remained unchanged, yet its familiarity had faded, because the space was no longer defined by physical boundaries alone, but by invisible limits shaped by uncertainty, limits that could not be mapped or tested without consequence, even if those consequences remained undefined. As time continued to pass without resolution, some prisoners began to sense a shift within themselves, a gradual acceptance that the absence of instruction might not be temporary, and that waiting for clarity could itself become a form of submission, one that demanded patience rather than compliance. The guards' continued presence reinforced this feeling, because their stillness suggested awareness rather than distraction, implying that whatever was unfolding under observation, not neglect, and that this observation was deliberate enough to endure without interruption. In this environment, the men began to recognize that the greatest challenge was no longer endurance of hardship, but endurance of ambiguity, because ambiguity required constant mental effort, draining strength in ways that hunger, cold, or fatigue never had. By now, the silence had ceased to feel like an absence of sound and had instead become a condition, one that shaped behavior, altered perception, and quietly tested limits without issuing commands or making threats. And as the afternoon gave way to longer shadows across the yard, the prisoners found themselves confronting an unsettling truth that being watched without guidance was beginning to change them more profoundly than being watched under strict control ever had. By the fifth day, It became increasingly difficult for the prisoners to remember exactly when the waiting had begun, because the absence of instruction had stretched itself so evenly across time that it no longer felt like an interruption, but like a condition they had always been meant to endure. What changed was not the camp, nor the guards, nor the routines that still framed the edges of the day, but the internal posture of the men themselves, who now carried an awareness that something had been placed before them without ceremony, something that did not demand an answer aloud, yet pressed for one all the same. The yard felt different in a way that could not be pointed to directly. Men stood where they had stood before, yet their attention no longer rested on the guards or the fences, but on the space between action and inaction, as though that narrow interval had become the true boundary of the camp, more decisive than wire or walls. Some prisoners began to sense that the waiting itself was no longer neutral, that remaining still was becoming a form of participation rather than avoidance, because each additional moment spent doing nothing carried the quiet implication of consent, even if no one had asked for it. Others felt the opposite pressure, a growing tension that suggested movement. Any movement might be the only way to reclaim agency, even if that movement proved to be a mistake, because the uncertainty of consequence had become heavier than the fear of punishment. The guards offered no indication of preference. They did not shift position to encourage compliance, nor did they step forward to provoke action, maintaining instead a distance that felt deliberate enough to suggest that the next development was expected to come from within the yard itself. This realization spread unevenly. Some men tightened their resolve, committing internally to wait indefinitely, convincing themselves that endurance was still the safest strategy, while others felt their patience thinning, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet humiliation of being left to decide without guidance, as though the structure that once defined captivity had been withdrawn as a test rather than a failure. The camp remained silent, yet the silence now felt charged, dense with possibility, because it had ceased to be empty and had become expectant, shaped by the collective awareness that something irreversible was taking shape, even if no one could yet say what it was. The smallest movements took on disproportionate significance. A shift of weight, a step taken forward and then withdrawn, a glance exchanged too quickly. Each one seemed to ripple outward, noticed not by authority, but by peers who understood that whatever happened next would redefine the unspoken rules they were already living under. By late afternoon, the sense of choice had become unavoidable, not because a decision had been demanded, but because the men could no longer pretend that waiting was merely passive, and this realization carried its own weight, heavier than any order ever had. The guards continued to observe, their silence unbroken, reinforcing the impression that the camp was no longer enforcing behavior, but revealing it, allowing each man to expose his own limits through restraint or action without interference. As shadows lengthened and the day drew toward evening, the prisoners stood in a state that felt suspended between obedience and autonomy, aware that the absence of instruction had already reshaped them, regardless of what came next. And in that suspended moment, before any clear outcome had emerged, one truth settled quietly among them. Because the choice had already been made, not through action, but through the simple fact that each man had been forced to confront it alone, without guidance, without explanation, and without the comfort of knowing whether he had chosen correctly. Nothing dramatic followed. There was no sudden punishment, no reward, no announcement that explained what the waiting had been for, and no moment that allowed the men to point back and say, this was when it happened, because whatever had changed did not arrive as an event, but as a quiet shift in how they understood themselves inside the camp. The routines eventually resumed. Orders returned. Movements regained their familiar structure, and the yard once again behaved like a place governed by rules rather than uncertainty. Yet the men moved through it differently now, carrying an awareness that had not existed before, an awareness that structure could be removed without warning and returned without explanation. No one spoke openly about the days without instruction. What had occurred did not lend itself to language, because language implied clarity, and clarity was exactly what had been withheld, leaving behind an experience that resisted summary and refused to settle into a lesson that could be easily explained. Some prisoners convinced themselves that the silence had been meaningless, that it had simply been another irregularity in a system already full of them, while others sensed that something far more deliberate had taken place, something designed not to control behavior directly, but to expose how quickly men adapted when guidance disappeared. The memory of that waiting did not fade with time. It surfaced later in small moments, in the hesitation before speaking, in the instinct to pause before acting, and in the quiet realization that obedience was no longer just a response to authority, but something that could emerge internally when uncertainty was allowed to persist. What lingered was not fear of punishment, but an understanding of how easily responsibility could be shifted without consent, how quickly men could be left alone with choices they had never been trained to make, and how heavy those choices felt when no one confirmed whether they were right or wrong. When the prisoners eventually left the camp, they carried many memories with them, some harsher and some easier to name, but the memory of that silence followed them in a different way, because it had not harmed them directly, and it had not offered relief either. Yet it had reshaped how they understood control, authority, and themselves. Because once a man is forced to choose without guidance, he does not forget what that feels like, and he does not easily return to the comfort of believing that responsibility always belongs to someone else. And long after the fences were gone and the routines dissolved, that quiet moment remained, not as a story easily told, but as a question that followed them forward, asking not what they did, but what they became while no one was telling them what to do. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.